Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I wanted to interrupt the British philosopher series when I'm a little behind on my research, so that makes sense. But also, I'd run into a series of arguments and conversations over the last little bit that made me ponder more directly the concept of what makes a valid argument. How does one construct one? How does one know when one has encountered a valid argument? And why does it matter? And the key here, or a key here, is that to make a true argument, small t true, not ontological truth, let's not worry about that, but at least something, with a pretty good deal of veracity to it, the argument must be valid, but not all valid arguments are true. Turns out that a lot of things that seem like they should be true or they couldn't possibly be true, right, turns out to be true. So making a valid argument does not necessarily mean that the argument is accurate, correct, or true. However, if it's not valid, if you've violated some of the general guidelines for a valid argument, then even if your outcome turns out to be correct, the argument was never true because it was never valid. So it's one of these tricky ones where you go, in construction of argument and logic and thinking, really process matters as much or more than outcome, because we want the truth, but you have to try and follow principle, because otherwise, you can just draw answers out of a hat, and some of them will inevitably line up nicely with the world, and therefore they'll look pretty good. But this is arguing? Is this thinking? No, this is simply random choice. It's a broken clock is correct twice a day kind of problem. So when we think about making a valid argument, what we mean is trying to follow the rules of logic and evidence to produce something that has a high probability, at least the highest we can achieve, given whatever our constraints are, of corresponding well with the world, or whatever part of the world that we're trying to discuss. So, first step in this is a clear thesis. And this may be the single most commonly violated principle. It's the most obvious, but if we're going to discuss something or have an argument, and by the way, when I say argue, I simply mean, I like the word explore better than argue, because argument always has that notion of shoutiness, but I mean argue in the sense of I have an idea. Is this idea accurate? Is there any merit to it? How do I discover that? How do I present it to other people so they can ponder and reflect on this? So more of a discussion or an exploration that is productive of hopefully coming up with some small t truth at the end. And so step one in this is to have a clear concept of what it is you're trying to demonstrate, explore, talk about, or know, and stating it as clearly and concisely as possible. Oh man, is this is just almost, you just over and over and over again, you see these quote unquote arguments or claims or presentations, and the fundamental problem is really they never define what it is that they're supposed to be presenting, and therefore you don't know how to judge what it is. So there's so many, it's so easy to assault these things. I don't mean to just do that, but so for instance on YouTube, there's just millions of videos about, here's the secrets, this 10 secrets to success. You can succeed, you can make your life successful, you can achieve. Okay, great, sure, these are all potentially helpful. What do you define success for me? What do you mean by success? And if I know what you mean by success, then I can at least look at that and go, so you're arguing that the best way to achieve this thing that you call success are the following. Now, if your definition of success is make a lot of money, and my definition of success is something else, enjoy my life, be healthy, write a lot of books, listen to music, go to the beach, have vitality, right? There's all these others possible, create wisdom, create beauty. So if I have a different definition of success, then already I can go, this presentation does not speak to me, because as correct as it may be for this person's understanding of what success is, it does not in any way correlate with my own. ipso facto, this is not going to be helpful to me. But generally what happens in these presentations is they just go, oh, success. This is a thing. We all understand what it is. We're not going to clearly define it. And so then, off we go, right? And so now you're going to tell me all these rules that may or may not have any bearing to me because I either don't know or it's unclear what precisely you mean by that. And like I said, generally they just mean, hey, make a lot of money. And if you make a lot of money, then you've succeeded, which is fine if that's your metric. But if it's not, then you don't have any secret to success. And your video should be titled 10 ways to make a lot of money, which is many videos say that as well. But at least they're clear, right? At least they say, hey, this is what we're talking about. So clear thesis. Also, much of the political argument is mired in this sort of vague. We have no clear argument that we're making, and then we just spend a lot of time throwing rocks at whomever we dislike. So that is another common one, where it's like, oh, this policy is terrible. Okay, we don't like this policy. Fine, clear thesis. What is it about that policy you don't like? It turns out they're never going to discuss that, right? So they just have these vague, overarching topics within which they throw rocks at whomever they dislike. And then part of this, of course, having a clear thesis, is any key terms that you're going to be using consistently in an argument or in a discussion. As much as possible, you need to make sure we're all on the same page, right? Like, okay, when I use the term success, or I use the term left wing, or I use the term socialism, or I use the term ideology, or if I use the term, I don't know, just whatever the key terms are that people are going to deploy in an argument, you need to make sure that you have a good sense that you're being clear about how you're using the term, and that you have a reasonable chance that the audience will also be, will understand this and be able to go, oh, okay. And by the way, definitional audience gets so tedious. It's so easy to get a tedious bunch of definitions. So I understand that these are not necessarily very appealing, and you can just beat definitional arguments to death because at some point it's like, well, is this a liminal case where maybe this could sneak in and that couldn't? It's like, okay, very tiresome. But all this is imperfect, but you're just trying to say, hey, just generally speaking, when we use the word success, or we use the word failure, or we use the word beautiful, let's just imagine this is sort of our context for understanding that. And then that's both helpful and necessary. Because if you use a bunch of terms that no one understands or you don't agree on, then either you get a bunch of different readings, which is not helpful, or, as generally happens, is people take a broad definition of some fuzzy term. Socialism, like I talked about before, is a classic here, or capitalism, all your isms, and then you just push the definition in whatever direction you need for whatever moment you are in your argument, and this isn't helpful, right? It just makes noise and confusion rather than having any chance of adding to clarity. So if we have a clear thesis and we have some general consensus, like, okay, here's how we're going to deploy our main terms, then you need to follow a logical structure. And the problem with logic is it's, again, it comes to us, from careful reasoning, and from, math is much easier to follow in mathematics. But in deploying logical structures in the real world, it's very tricky. I mean, it's necessary. So A, necessary. B, tricky, because you have all these fallacies that you want to avoid. And the clearest way, I think, to understand logical structures, I don't want to go through all the fallacies because there are too many of them, but it's avoiding the construction of logically invalid arguments just by its structure. So if you make certain kinds of logical mistakes, then basically no matter what you're saying, it doesn't matter because it's not wrong, it's meaningless because the logic has been violated. And so, for instance, there's this problem called the Post Hoc Fallacy, and it just means it's where you say something happens, something else happens after that. Therefore, whatever happened to A caused B. And our world is 100% filled with post hoc fallacies. Oh my gosh. Anything that happens after anything else is apparently caused by that. So it's maddening. Like really, it's once you recognize this fallacy, you just see it everywhere. So well, my kid went to soccer camp and they got a scholarship to someplace to play soccer. Ipso facto, you should send your kid to soccer camp because then they'll get a scholarship to this place. And even here, you can say, well, yeah, soccer camp probably has some causal relationship with getting a scholarship, but it might also just be that your kid is really good at soccer, and whether or not they went to the camp, they might have gotten a scholarship anyway. So it definitely happened after, but the causal linkage, then you have to ask, well, why did your kid go to soccer camp? Well, your kid went to soccer camp because they're really good at soccer and they're interested in it. And so the soccer camp can be an expression of something rather than a cause of something, right? Like the reason your kid is at soccer camp is because they're really good and they want to play soccer. And so when they get a scholarship a couple of years later or whatever, you go, oh, okay, that soccer camp may have made a contribution. So I'm not saying it didn't, but just because that linkage seems so strong, it's like, yeah. And by the way, this is a subclass of the correlation does not equal causation, which is, again, if this is just one kind of correlation does not equal causation, but it's maybe the most common one. So that just because something happens after something else, and even in the case of like the soccer camp where you go, oh, that probably made some contribution, but did it really? And the converse, of course, is, and if I send my kid who does not want to play soccer, does not want to go to soccer camp, has no interest in little sports ball types games, and I send them to soccer camp, I can't really be shocked when they don't get a scholarship, right? So these fallacies, many of them, there's just lots of them, are all based on this notion of, hey, how do I avoid making arguments that in their structure make these fundamental logical mistakes? And if you've heard about the trivium from the ancient world, grammar and rhetoric and so on, a big part of the trivium was simply learning to construct written arguments. So grammar was written arguments that were coherent, and rhetoric was spoken arguments that were coherent. So I mean, this sort of sense of trying to construct logical, meaningful arguments goes way back. It's probably the core of the intellectual tradition of the West, is this debate about how the hell do we do this, right? How do we make arguments that are sensible and people can follow along and give us results that are meaningful and helpful. And so you want to come up with structures that, and again, what structure will work for you is going to vary a lot depending on the subject you're dealing with, the kind of evidence you're trying to deploy, the thesis you're presenting. So you just, you have to ponder, but if you can avoid the post hoc fallacy, any correlation causation fallacy, assuming the conclusion. This is a common one where people will go, let me tell you why who somebody is bad, right? We don't like Ukrainian musicians. I have no idea why. I'm sorry to all you Ukrainian musicians out there, but for some reason we think they're evil. And then you just say, well, look at this stuff, here's this, and this. And you go, well, why is all that? Where'd that come from? Like, oh, this is all the evil stuff Ukrainian musicians do. They're evil. How do you know they're evil? Well, they're Ukrainian musicians. And so you get this cyclical argument. Another common version of this is you see this with religious texts, Bible and so on, where people say, oh, how do we know it's true? Well, it's in the Bible. How do we know the Bible is true? Well, it says so in the Bible. Well, you see, now you've just created this logical problem here that's like, look, you can't have the proof of a text being true that the text says it's true. Or you can, but this is not then everything is true in the universe at all times. So not that helpful of a criteria. So it's logically flawed. So avoiding these sorts of logical mistakes. Then if you have sort of a series of logical claims that sort of make sense, probably the most difficult one now is evidence. Now, evidence comes in lots of flavors. Again, it depends on what subject we're trying to debate or understand or correlate. Is you have to have, evidence for things. This is key. Also, evidence against things. Oh, we hate this part. I mean, if we're arguing in favor of something, our absolute prejudice is to look for all of the evidence that supports it, and demonstrate that. This is not a valid argument, because if you only look for the evidence in support of things, you can prove just about anything. In fact, I think it's one of the groundworks for almost every conspiracy theory. Simply just decides whatever it is they're trying to prove in the conspiracy is you just say, okay, here's evidence for this, here's evidence for it, here's evidence for it, here's evidence for it. And pretty soon people go, oh, well, that is a lot of evidence for something. It's like, okay, fair enough. What's the evidence against it? Rats. Often there is vastly more and vastly more convincing evidence opposed to some ideas than there are for it. It doesn't mean there's no evidence for the existence of things, but it just means there's more evidence against it. So you can say, oh, I think there's a conspiracy of some group, the Ukrainian musicians. Let's just blame them for everything. And then you can come up with all this evidence. Like, look, these Ukrainian musicians are heads of several major banks in the world. And these Ukrainian musicians are, military commanders over here. And these Ukrainian musicians control that. And you go, wow, look at that. Yeah, all these what are the chances that these Ukrainian musicians would be in these positions of power? And look at all the influence that they have. And then you go, yeah, and then you go, well, okay, what's the counter argument there? And you go, well, yeah, there's a lot of non-Ukrainian musicians in positions of power, and it turns out, in fact, there's vastly more non-Ukrainian musicians in positions of influence in the world than there are Ukrainian musicians in positions of influence in the world, and so on and so forth. And so the capacity to make an argument only by looking at the evidence for something is intellectually seductive, but also completely disabling. If you don't construct a balanced argument where you look at both sides or multiple sides, false dichotomy, by the way, assuming there's only two sides, if you look at the evidence for a whole range of possibilities, that's when you start making some serious progress. The problem is, and one reason I was spurred to do this, is it's time consuming, makes everything confusing, and you have to make a judgment call. No getting around this, by the way. This is why small t truth is what we're pursuing here, because this is a series of judgment calls. You're like, okay, how do I decide what evidence is germane at this moment? How do I present enough evidence within the context that says, yeah, the evidence for my argument seems to outweigh the evidence against my argument on balance, and come up with some fair, quote unquote fair, arbitrary, right, difficult to define, that says, yeah, this seems to be a reasonable presentation of the evidence as best I can determine, given my space and time constraints. And I'll give you two examples of this. Actually, I ran into this specific problem. I was doing some writing. Hello, Brian. And I basically attacked some people who very much need attacking, by the way. So, but in the time, in the very small amount of space that I had to launch this attack, it turns out, and Brian pointed this out quite correctly, that you need to have a more balanced understanding of the environment to make that attack reasonable and well supported. And if you only have a limited amount of space, then what might be a reasonable and well supported concept to say this is not a very good system or organization is really just rock throwing, right? Because you don't have enough time to explore the nuances and to provide enough evidence to make it reasonable for the reader, unless the reader is already agreeing with you, which notice this is not the point, right? If you just want the reader to agree with you, sure, you choose bad people and you throw rocks at them, or bad organizations, you throw rocks at them. You don't have to provide any evidence really, or you just little pieces of dribs of drabs of evidence. But since your audience is already agreeing with you, this is fine, quote unquote, but it's not really fulfilling what you should be doing, which is to try to give a full consideration and say, hey, even if I have reservations, even if I have concerns, here's the context, here's where this comes from, here's the diversity of background, here's other viewpoints on this, And so while, all my rock throwing might be valid when taken out of context, really what I'm asking you to do is just, hey, let's just hate on these people. It's a classic example of what's called a straw man, by the way. You create a mock of a position, and then you attack that mock rather than the actual thing itself, which tends to be more complicated and subtle. Another example of this is when I did my Heidegger lecture, I really struggled because Heidegger there's just no way around it. Heidegger, third-rate, vicious, awful human being in many, many ways. Super Nazi, getting people fired, pushing the Jews out of their jobs, exploiting his students, stealing ideas. What could you do? Right? Really, not a good person. Hugely, hugely influential philosopher. Right? So these things turn out, unfortunately, not to be mutually exclusive. And so I could give a lecture. When I did the Heidegger lecture, I could have just said, okay, let's spend most of our time, abusing Heidegger and saying, okay, I had some ideas, but let's dismiss them because he's such an awful person. Or I could have said, you know what, let's just ignore the fact that this work was done by this, really suboptimal example of humanity. But it's hard because, A, it seems significant, and B, it did influence a lot of his thinking. It was not what made him a not very good person actually influenced and is expressed in parts of his philosophy. And so what I had to do, or I tried to do, whether or not I was successful, I don't know, but what I tried to do is give some context and then create some balance, because my thesis, again, back to the thesis, was, you important thinkers, here's an important thinker, why, and how do we understand them? And so trying to create a holistic understanding, or at least a more nuanced understanding, see, that's the tricky bit, but also I think the necessary bit. So when we're deploying evidence, there's all these elements to it to say, what's the best evidence? How do I make sure I've included most of as much relevant evidence as I can within the time and space constraints I have? So you can do things in 20 or 30 or 50 or 100 pages that you cannot do in, 2 or 5 or 8. So even, for instance, in the context of this little podcast or whatever this is, I keep thinking, maybe I'll just go through and list, the 20 major logical fallacies and then explain them. And then I'll go, well, at that point, I've got an hour of logical fallacies, which are important for understanding logical structure, but perhaps not perfectly necessary for making this notion of the overall structure of a valid argument. So that's why I just sort of said, well, maybe another time we'll go over all the logical fallacies, but for now, just focus on that. So time and space constraints are real, right? We're trying to make arguments and get understanding. And so how do you balance the need for evidence, the need for trying to comprehend the nuances of a situation, and then presenting it fairly to a reader so that they can both understand what you're saying, understand how you derived what you're saying, and come to their own conclusions. And that's the real goal when you're trying to make an argument or trying to present some information or explore a topic for the reader, which is different from what we're usually told. We're usually told, we're trying to convince people of things. This is a horrible model. Just get that out of your mind. It's what we're trying to do, by the way. But as much as we can possibly get that out of your mind, because what you want to do is present material that the reader will be able to ingest in themselves and go, okay, I see what you're saying. I might disagree with you, but I see the evidence you've deployed and the arguments you've made, and I go, those are good. And I see how you derived that conclusion or conclusions, or you've come up with this idea, or you've enriched my understanding of something. But I might say, I have reservation about this, or I would like to understand that more, go more in depth here. This is the ideal situation. You're not supposed to try and bludgeon someone or convince them of a position. You're supposed to present evidence that allows them to understand how you came to your conclusions, and then they can follow along and go, I see how they determined that. I agree with them, or this seems meaningful, or this seems helpful for me, and I'm trying to make another argument over here. So I'll use some of their insights and understanding and something that I'm going to try to do because they seem to have done a good piece of work here. That's really the goal. And when you're deploying evidence, that needs to be, I would say, one of the things to always keep in mind is, how do I help someone else understand how I've come to where I am, and give them sufficient amounts of evidence that bring them along. So it's an invitation to think together rather than what we almost invariably encounter, which is me trying to hit you with a shovel and make you think whatever it is I think, so that if I hate something, you're going to hate it. If I like something, you'll like it. End of topic, right? This is the model of sophistry, by the way, from the ancient world. These people were called sophists because they would just use whatever rhetorical ploys were necessary to get people to come along with them. This is why ancient world was very concerned about tyrants, because they were afraid that tyrants would say anything and do anything to convince you to go along with them. They also had some weird rules about speaking and arguing publicly, like you couldn't move your arms, right? You weren't supposed to just gesticulate wildly, because I thought, oh, this is going to appeal to the emotions and not to the argument. By the way, this would make me completely mute. I must move my arms when I speak. So that would be a bad rule for me. But they really were concerned that we're focusing on the structure and meaning and content of an argument, not on any particular outcome as far as just tricking you into believing something. So evidence for and against, and how to balance that in a time space. These are all judgment calls, but that's what you do. And you can research something and be totally careful and all that. And then, after you send it off for publication or to have a conversation with someone, you might hit a piece of evidence the next day and you go, well, that changes things, or that changes my understanding. And finally, and this is what I talked about in the problem with thinking, is the only way really, as far as I can tell, to make this work is to have a love of truth. Not a love of convincing people or a love of winning or advancing, but a love of understanding, right? To go, I really do want to know what the evidence opposed to this is. I do want to know the subtleties, the complexities, the difficulties that we're going to encounter along this way. And then when you have that concept, you go, this will help me more in my understanding, because I love understanding more than all these other putative goals that I'm theoretically trying to work for. And so when you deploy evidence that way, and you use your logical structures that way, and you have theses that work this way, you kind of can understand, like, this is potentially how meaning can be constructed, and how knowledge can be advanced, and how insight can be both arrived at and shared in a way that sort of contributes to everyone. So this is the key to making a valid argument. You have a clear idea of what you're arguing with all your major terms, sort of in some sense of agreement. You have a reasonable logical structure that doesn't violate any of the core principles there. And you have evidence that is representative of the complexity of the world. Of course, we're big world, finite mortal thinkers, but sort of trying to take in the complexities both for and against, and that just make it hard to understand. And actually sometimes the evidence just suggests we don't have enough evidence, and all combined in a way that the reader can follow along, understand how you achieved what your ideas or insights are, and then sort of come to their own sense of whether or not they want to go along with you. Now you have a chance of having a valid argument, or that would be a valid argument, by the way, not that complex, but it's just not a true argument. So unfortunately, this is where we end up anytime we're talking about these kinds of problems, is because the world is often, subtle, complex beyond human capacity to understand. And so all kinds of ideas where people were completely reasonable, they were looking at the evidence, they were following the rules of logic, they come to conclusions that actually turn out not to be supported because new evidence comes along, blows it out of the water. different insights, the understanding of the world changes. So, the people now, everyone likes to make fun of the theory of the ether, that was popular until, roughly 1900 or so, a little later than that. But there was a lot of reason to believe that an ether existed, right? There was all kinds of evidence for this. It solved lots of problems. So it wasn't just crazy people believing in the ether. It was, hey, this is a reasonable extrapolation of the evidence. And the contrary is that there's just a big vacuum out there. It seemed weird. How much evidence is there for the contrary position? And so on balance, even people who said, maybe it is a vacuum, maybe that's what we're dealing with, but the ether seems to work and explain things like how all these forces propagate through space. So you have to come up with something else to explain lots of actions. And so it was a very tricky subject to work through. But this happens over and over and over again. Why did what caused World War I? Nobody still seems to be able to agree. People agree World War I happened, right? Historians are sort of clear on that one, but what the hell? How did we get into that mess exactly? And by the way, if you want to avoid world wars, it's really good to have a understanding of hey, let's not do that again. That was unpleasant for everybody involved. How did we get there? Let's not do it again. It's a really, really fraught historical conversation. And not because people are ill-intentioned, but because people are going, yeah, it's just the world is complicated. There's, in this case, masses of evidence, lots and lots of players with different complex ideas of how the world works. And then one day you're in World War I. So, just because you have valid, reasonable arguments with evidence and the whole structure doesn't mean you've either solved a problem, arrived at the truth, or that even if what you conclude, the insight you have seems functional for a time, in the future, near or distant, it may cease to function. So validity gets you in the ball game, right? It's the goal. Truth, that's a very high bar. But at least if you're making valid arguments, you tend to be helping yourself gain a greater understanding of the world, and perhaps some insight, and being able to produce it in a way that you can share with people and help them with insight and understanding. That's, to me, this is the goal. And if you keep your eye on the valid argument format, then you at least have a chance of achieving that. Thank you very much.